So while the Independent Electoral Commission has announced that it will accept the findings of the Moseneke report, there are still questions around the feasibility of postponing this year's polls. The findings of this inquiry drawing a mixed reaction, with some warning that if this matter is not handled correctly, it could lead the country to some kind of constitutional crisis. Let's make sense of this now. Bring in our guest, Professor Erwin Schwella. He's the Dean at the School of Social Innovation at Hugenote Kollege. Prof, great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time. It's great to have you on the program. So as far as you're concerned, is it a far-gone conclusion that the elections are postponed? In other words, is this an easy decision for the courts?
No, it will not be an easy decision because a lot of legal argument will be presented, also in conjunction with a lot of political issues and other issues. So the Commission now has accepted the Moseneke report, and they have to seek an order from a competent court. And the first question arises, which will be the competent court? So legally, I have checked the electoral court, and I think it is probably not going to be easy to approach them for an order, because they might be the court of the next instance should anybody who wants to challenge their decision on whether it goes ahead or not take legal action. So it means it's a high court. It can also probably not be the constitutional court, because the constitutional court needs to be a court of revision in the final instance. So that's the first question, and therefore legal counsel is being sought. Secondly, it then depends, of course, on, the issues here is about whether you can have a free and fair election under these conditions. Now, the IAC, and that's an interesting point, I think, will subsequent to the election have to certify the election as free and fair. If they are now already in a position where they've got a strong opinion from previous Justice Moseneke, and their own opinion is it cannot be free and fair, then it becomes in some ways also a very interesting legal but also political point. Have they got an unbiased opinion? Should the election go ahead? Let's assume the court says no, it has to go ahead because we can't change the constitution through judicial action. That is a function of parliament, which is the legislature. But let's assume the court says yes, now the election does not go ahead and it gets contested in court by political parties. Let's assume they say no, we're not going to have the elections, or yes, we're going to have the elections, but the IEC then subsequently certifies or does not certify it to be a free and fair election. So it's a conundrum of choices, and there's not one good choice here. It seems that we have options and choices between a number of things that are less than optimal, rather than, a good versus a bad choice.
Right. Let's stay then with scenario building, because it appears that's all we really have at our disposal. If the courts were to postpone the elections, as ordinary South Africans, should we be comfortable with the idea that a group of judges who aren't elected are essentially in charge of a process of elections affecting millions of other people? Is that, I guess, to the tenets of constitutionalism, so to speak?
Well, constitutionalism says that there is the separation of powers between the different arms of state. So under normal conditions, we cannot argue that because the majority even of the people, whether they do it through parliament or whatever other institutions, because they should preferably be not doing it through populism and pillaging. The majority is a very important part of what we have in our constitutional democracy, but their majority opinion has to be channeled through institutions. So Parliament, if Parliament sits and changes the constitution, then the majority will have, through Parliament, had a say in whether we have the elections or not. That seems to be not indicated, because it's going to be very difficult to get such a majority. The courts have, I think, got a serious issue around whether they can make a decision about a constitutional article in the Constitution, just as the courts, in the sense that, they have judicial oversight, but that would mean probably legally and factually that they are changing the Constitution.
Yeah.
I don't think they have that jurisdiction.
Right. That's exactly what I was hoping to actually get into. If the courts were to allow for this postponement, what does that say about the provision of the Constitution, which is actually very clear, that there should be an election held within a certain amount of time? And the Constitution actually doesn't say about whether or not we feel that that election would be free and fair. So again, if we do find ourselves in a situation where any court is allowing the postponement to happen, is that essentially finding a provision of the Constitution to be unconstitutional?
That's a very, very complex legal question and will be argued by senior counsel, obviously from all parties concerned. We have already seen that there are notices given of contestation from some political groupings. So it is not an easy answer to give because that is why we have courts to decide these things authoritatively. My current best opinion will be that it will be a long shot for a court to make a ruling to say that we actually order that the election does not go ahead, and then they will have to argue that in some ways we have changed the Constitution. We are the judicial authority, and we've now changed the Constitution, which actually should be done by Parliament with a majority. And by the way, because it's a constitutional majority, a weighted majority. So this is going to become very interesting in terms of what is happening right now and whether the court will take this on and how they do it.
Speaking about Parliament, I mean, we can't really remember the last time there was any kind of unanimous agreement amongst parliamentarians themselves. But let's perhaps try to consider the role of political parties nonetheless within this conundrum, as you put it. I mean, how important is the buy-in of these political parties, especially considering the role they play in any election?
We can expect that this particular issue will break down, I would predict, more or less in the same way it breaks down in terms of the whole idea of expropriation without compensation, which actually means that it's very difficult to get the required majority in Parliament. So even if and to make that very concrete, one would assume that probably, and there's a speculation, of course, the ANC and the Economic Freedom Front fighters might want to say we want to postpone the election, amongst others because they're not really ready for the election. However, the other parties might be not convinced, and then you will not get the required majority to amend the Constitution. In any case, it's an onerous process for all of the right reasons to amend the Constitution, because you will be creating a particular precedent. So I'm assuming that if you go the parliamentary route, and I'm also assuming that Judge Moseneke decided that would not be a good route to go, because first of all, it will be a lengthy process, and October is looming large. And secondly, it will be difficult to get a parliamentary required weighted majority. So now we go to the courts, but that's also not an easy option, because the courts, I am not sure whether there is no precedent in this regard, so we don't have a precedence in terms of cases. It will be an argument that has to be taken, and then a court will have to decide. And that court that decides, well, then you can also take that on appeal, and October is looming large.
Absolutely. Fascinating legal conundrum, as you put it. Prof, thanks very much indeed for your insights in this. Professor Erwin Schwella is the Dean at the School of Social Innovation at Hugenote College. Once again, appreciate your time indeed.